Welcome to today's tutorial on lighting setups. I'm going to talk you through 3 lighting setups and some variations with each of those main setups. The first light setup we're going to look at today will use one light and a bounce for some fill. We're using the Flashpoint 8600 for this light setup, but you can really do this with any kind of a light. It doesn't actually matter, just some kind of a strobe. You could even really do this with a continuous light if you wanted to. So what we're using is the 30 by 40 softbox, and this is just a regular board for fill. We have the grid on the front of the softbox to control the spill of the light. It's probably going to cut the power down a little bit. I'm going to be firing this off at 1/8 power for most of the day. That's usually the range I like to be at for the size and shape of the space I'm working in. This grid is going to prevent unwanted light from going on our backdrop, floor, ceiling, etc. It's one of those things that's just going to give us more control. It's definitely preferred. Something like this is really good in a small space because there's a lot of things for the light to bounce off of, a lot of things that can get illuminated. This is an important consideration. If we were in a bigger space, it would be less important, but might still be desirable depending on what kind of effect you want. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to angle this at about 45 degrees from the camera to the subject, from the light to the subject, and then I'm going to raise this a little higher, but we're going to have this angled at roughly this angle here. This is like about 45 degrees down. I know it's not perfect. I don't have a protractor. We talked about this. Who uses protractors? That's weird. You're weird, don't be weird. So we're going to have our key light 45 degrees and 45 degrees. It's going to give us a nice light to shadow gradation, and it'll show us some shape to the face and to the figure. It'll give us the possibility of having that little Rembrandt triangle that's so desirable that everybody likes that Rembrandt lighting. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this whiteboard over here to bounce some light back in for fill. This is just a simple piece of white foam core. There's nothing at all fancy about this at all. Even a little. None fancy. Just foam. We've decided to use the bounce card for fill because it's a little bit more natural than using a second light. If I have my key light over here and I put a fill light over here, I'll have a little bit of cross lighting going on and I might get some strange shadows, and subconsciously it's not going to look natural. So I definitely want to stay away from that for this particular setup. It's possible to use a fill light, and in the next setup we're going to talk a little bit about how we can do that in a way that I feel looks more natural. But for this, one light, simple, straightforward, basic entry-level setup, we're going to just use this, and this is going to fill in, right? And what's going to happen is that this will bounce the light back at less of an intensity than this, obviously because it's reflected, and so it won't create any strange shadows. It will bring up the exposure on the darker part of the image, so we can have less contrast, and if we need to add some more in later, we can, but I think most likely we'll be pretty happy out of camera with the look that we're going to get here. The variation we're going to use will have a kicker light, but I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to it. In the meantime, let's shoot. I've got the Sony A7 Mark III, I've got the 24-105 f4, and I got my remote trigger, and I am, in fact, shooting tethered. I don't know if you can see the computer over there. I'm shooting tethered with Capture One. I like to shoot tethered whenever possible. It gives me more options as far as my exposure and reading the scene and what's going on. I can check the specific luminance values on any part of the image that I want. I don't have to worry about using a light meter. I think that's real old-fashioned technology. I guess some people disagree. Whatever. I'm not shooting film. I'm not using a light meter. The tethered shooting is nice for a couple of reasons. Not just because it allows me more options as far as reading my exposure and seeing what's going on, but it allows me to apply my edits as I go. I can change the images if I want, and that way I can be closer to a final delivery at the end of the shoot. I've had some sessions where I've edited as I went along and been able to deliver to my client at the very end of the session without any no fuss, no mess. It's a very easy, streamlined process. I think it's a great way to go about things. I'm a big fan of it. Enough about that. Let's get into the shooting. Today, helping us out with this tutorial video is our model Mandy. Mandy, say hi to the camera.
Hi.
I've got my light set up where I want it. My camera settings are 1/200th of a second, f8, ISO 200. I have it set to f8 and 1/200th of a second because I want to eliminate all the ambient light from the scene and only use the light that I'm providing with my strobe. So let's take our first exposure. So I'm going to be evaluating my exposure as I go using Capture One. I'm mostly just going to be checking for the exposure value on the highlights and the shadows. I want to make sure my highlights aren't overexposed, and I want to make sure my shadows are not underexposed. I'm looking to keep things in a certain range. I want to make sure I have as much data as possible in my raw file. I'm doing that by maintaining a sort of balanced exposure. Like I said, not too much on the highlights, not too low on the shadows. This is going to give me a maximum amount of flexibility when I get to post, so I can change things around and do what I want to do with the image. I'm so low. I'm going to shoot a few more with this lighting setup, and then I'm going to show you guys the first variation, and then we'll keep going from there. All right? What we're going to do now is take the light setup that we've been using, and we're going to modify it very slightly. We're calling this variation 1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a little bit of a kicker light to give a little more dimension to our model. So what we have is basically like a 1x3 strip box, again with a grid. What we're going to do is we're going to just sort of bring this around the back, and we're going to point this across Mandy and this towards this key light, so they're going to go across each other. Now this is going to give us a little bit more separation from our background, and this is going to give a little more three-dimensionality to our model. I think this is like a nice touch. This light is going to be coming in a real low power, probably like 1/32, 1/64 power, something like that. This is an AD200, so it's much less powerful light than the 600 already. But we are still coming in real low because the kicker light is very easy with a light like this to overpower and come in overexposed. All right, let's do this. Very nice. If you look camera right, you can see what this light is doing. It's creating a little bit of illumination on that darker side of her face. It's giving us a little bit more three-dimensionality to the image, and it's giving us a little separation from the background. It was a little bit harder to see the separation between her hair and the background before, and it's easier now. She's a model with dark hair, so it's very easy to lose the hair on a dark background like this. So this is another reason that you might want to do something like this. So these look really good. Maybe shoot a couple more, maybe not, who knows. See how we feel. And we're going to move on to the second light setup of the day. Okay, for the second light setup, we are going to use 65-inch Octabox, again with the grid, same purpose. What we're going to do though with this is we're going to angle it at almost 90 degrees across the subject, and we're going to place it in front of the subject. So what we're going to do is going to catch the light just from the outside, just going to feather it a little bit. Most of the light, unfortunately, is going to be wasted. We might have to turn the power up. I'll see when we start shooting. And we're going to do something different for fill. So instead of a card this time, we are going to use a second light. And this is typically the only way I would use a second light for fill, and that is to have it basically on axis with the camera. We're going to take the 8200, and we're going to use 65-inch umbrella. Just going to slide it up. Anytime you're using an umbrella, basically what you want to do is slide your umbrella as far from the light as you can without getting any light spill around the sides of the umbrella. This way the light can bounce in, fill the umbrella, and bounce out as much as possible. Now the thing with the umbrella versus a softbox is the umbrella is going to throw this light everywhere. It's going to light the whole room. They're a very sloppy modifier. I don't use them for much, but they're definitely good for something like this. So what I've done is I've put the 8200 in, it's in the umbrella, and I'm going to raise this up, and as you can see, I'm going to keep it just about in line with the camera. I might move it a little bit right now. The thing you need to know about anytime you boom a light, there's two important rules to keep in mind when you boom, right? You always want to keep the weight, the load, has to be over one of the legs. Okay, so all the weight is here. That way it's a little bit more stable. The other thing you want to keep in mind is this grip head spins to loosen in the left direction, and then to the right to tighten. So you always want to put the weight on the side that it spins to tighten. This way, if this bears down over here, anything happens, it's going to tighten the grip head as opposed to loosening it. If you put it on the other side and it's too much weight, it can loosen itself and fall down. We've got our key in place right here at about 90 degrees. And what we've done is we have our model standing sort of in line, like behind the light. So this light is mostly shining in front of her right here. Now what's going to happen is most of the light's going to go here, and it's fine. We don't care about it. But that edge is going to feather onto her. It's going to be nice. Since it's such a wide modifier, a little bit of the light is going to wrap around her. Now this is going to be a very strong side light. It's going to have a lot of contrast. It's going to be a real moody image, so that's why we have that fill in place. And since the fill is in line with the camera, it's going to bring up those shadows from the camera direction, and it won't create any strange shadows because they'll be blocked, right? It's in line with the camera, so it's not, you're not going to see them. They'll be, you know, elsewhere. I also have this kicker light in position like before. We're not going to turn it on right away. We're going to take a couple shots without it just to show you guys the light setup with just the 2. Then we'll show it to you with the 3. The AD600 and the AD200 are both coming in at 1/8 power. Obviously the AD200 is a less powerful light, so that means much less actual output from that particular device. So we adjusted the power levels a little bit from what we started at because I felt like I wasn't getting the exposure exactly that I wanted. So we bumped this up a stop to 1/4 power, and this is at 1/16. So we wanted to separate that a little bit more and get them a little farther apart and increase the contrast in camera. We're set up, we're in position, we're gonna take a couple shots, and let's see what we think. As you can see, this look has much more contrast to it. It's a little bit harder to see the separation between subject and the background. If I want, I can increase the power on the fill light, and that'll brighten up the image, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second, and then we can turn on the kicker and you can see sort of the difference in what we're going for. Okay, so now we have both lights at about 1/4 power, and you can see from these images that everything's coming in much more evenly lit. We're really losing the contrast. Everything looks a little bit flatter. This might be the kind of look that you want. I don't particularly love it. We're going to turn the fill light down to 1/16 power, and then we're going to bring in that kicker light at 1/32 like we had it before. We've got that fill and the kicker are both on now, so let's see what this looks like. This light setup looks pretty similar to the one we started with earlier. I think it's a little bit more contrasty. The background's a little darker here. This won't lend itself as well to every kind of look like that first setup did. That first setup is definitely more utilitarian in my opinion. When you use this to sort of get something a little bit more moody, I think it works really well and it gives that kind of a feel that maybe we're looking for here. Let's get into our third light setup. We've come to the third light setup of the day. Possibly the most dramatic of all the light setups we're going to use today. I find that this particular light setup works really well for athletic portraits, anything where people are super muscled and flexing. This really accentuates that kind of a body type very well, but this also is like highly dramatic otherwise. So let's talk you through the light setup. You may remember the kicker light from before. This is going to provide us rim light on the left side of the subject. Look at that, another one, same thing. It's pretty much equidistant from the center as that light, and what these are going to do is going to point at the back, and these are going to create a nice rim light around the entire subject and create that separation. We might turn them up a little bit to get that sort of hot like highlight. So those are the rim lights. You have one on each side. Those are coming in relatively low power, probably going to be like 1/16, 1/8. Maybe I'll bump them up to 1/4 if I want to get them like real hot, and that'll be an interesting look, like super contrasty. Our key light is over here. Our key light is almost overhead. It's not exactly pointed straight down. We are tilted a little bit, and this is again the 65-inch octa. And what we're going to do is we're going to stand our subject probably roughly where I'm standing now, and you're going to get some really dramatic downlighting. And then these are going to do the rim, like I said, and we're going to see how we feel about it. I might want to throw in something in this region for fill, just to bounce a little bit of light back up into the eyes. It really depends on how it's looking. Even though I've shot this setup a few times before, every time I do it, I feel a little bit different. Sometimes they use the fill, sometimes they don't. So we're going to start without the fill board, and we're going to just shoot. We're going to go from there. We're going to see what happens. You ready? You ready? Who's ready? Ready? You ready? You ready?
I'm ready.
All right, I think I'm ready. Let's see what we got here. So this is main light at 1/4 power with the rim lights coming in at 1/16 power. I feel pretty good about everything so far. The only thing is I just want to bring in a little bit of fill. So what we want to do with this is reflect light under Mandy's chin and under her eyes, because I felt like without this fill it was coming in a little too dark and a little too contrasty, which may be something you want, maybe not. It's really up to you. I think that's much better. That fills in the shadows a little bit more. So this is a pretty dramatic type of look. You can see what's going on here. We've got those shadows filled in from that fill board. We've got that rim lighting coming in from around the sides, which is nice. We have this sort of really dramatic down lighting, which is something that I like a lot. I think that's it for the tutorial for today. So if you have any more questions, you want to know anything else, feel free to comment, message me, anything like that. You don't need a lot of room to create dramatic and interesting portraits. If you know what your lighting is doing and you're intentional about having a plan on what you're going to shoot, you can do some pretty impressive stuff. Thanks for watching.